Donald Trump's election surprised most pollsters and political observers. The USC LA Times poll, however, was one of the few national polls to accurately predict a possible Trump victory. How did the USC LA Times poll get it right? And how will California's Democratic-controlled government respond to a Republican takeover of the federal government? We'll ask Dan Schnur, the executive director of the Unruh Institute of Politics at USC. The Trump effect. Is California about to become Texas 2.0?
Additional funding for the Maddy report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the state capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Donald Trump's election was a real shocker. Many polls didn't see it coming. There was one major exception, the USC LA Times poll. Our guest is Dan Schnur, the director of the Jesse Unruh Institute of Politics at USC. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Mark, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So how did you get it right when everybody else got it so wrong?
Well, you know, I would love to gloat on your television program, but in fact, we didn't get it right. At least we didn't get it any more right than anyone else did. Our poll showed Donald Trump winning on Election Day, but of course, we don't poll the Electoral College. We poll the popular vote. But I think what is instructive from our poll, and will be useful going forward, is even though we weren't any more right or any more wrong than the other polls, I think we examined the electorate through a different lens. And what we did is, rather than simply measuring preference, are you for candidate A or candidate B, we measured voter intensity and asked our respondents on a scale of 0 to 100, how certain are you of your vote? And what we saw all election long is that Donald Trump's core supporters, while outnumbered, were much more motivated and much more fervent in their support than Clinton's base. And that, of course, is what ultimately ended up winning the election for him.
And that's the key. They got to come out and vote. And he clearly got them to come out and vote. So Trump the campaigner was a bit controversial, broke a lot of political norms. Are we going to expect, or should we expect the same thing from Donald Trump the president?
You know, I have been making wrong predictions about Donald Trump for the last 17 months.
You're not the only one.
Well, I have no intention of breaking my streak now. You know, it's pretty clear, even as we're taping this, even at the early stages of his transition, that he's not going to change who he is. Very few 70-year-old men who've been very successful in their careers wake up one morning and say, I'm going to become a fundamentally different person. Right. And I suspect that once he takes office, he'll realize that his words carry so much more weight and have so much more impact than they ever have in the past, that he'll make some adjustment. But this is who he is. It's not just what voters liked about him that caused them to support him, but it's who he is as an individual. And while he makes some adjustments, that's not going to change.
You're not seeing a change. Okay, so, you know, there are checks and balances in our government. Compromise is necessary to move things forward politically, even if your party controls the presidency, the Congress, and soon the Supreme Court. So will President Trump continue to be kind of play that role of disruptor, or is he going to begin to transition to maybe a role of a deal maker?
It's probably going to be both. And as he's shown throughout his career in business, he feels perfectly comfortable being both a disruptor and a deal maker. And in fact, what he seems to believe from his business career is that being a disruptor gives him more leverage when it comes to negotiations. We saw this very shortly after his inauguration in terms of his telephone call with the Taiwanese leader. Very out of the ordinary, very provocative. It had the people in Washington very upset that he was unnecessarily confronting China. But he seems to believe that this is an approach that will make China more amenable to working with him.
How is he going to work with, congressional Republicans aren't completely on board with his program. I mean, trade or infrastructure projects, entitlements, how's that going to play out?
Well, and that's a challenge going forward, because on one hand, the Republicans in Congress are very aware that their constituents voted for Trump in overwhelming numbers. On the other, they have deeply held beliefs of their own. And the line, not just for Speaker Paul Ryan, but for people like Congressman Devin Nunes, that's a very fine line to walk. And I suspect what you'll see from Ryan, from McCarthy, from Nunes, and other smart Republicans in Congress is you'll see them being very, very loud when they agree with him and a little bit quieter when they disagree. In other words, they'll make their disagreements known, particularly on issues like trade, and perhaps even on some of the way his infrastructure package comes together. But I would say that the way they achieve that balance is on volume. Loud support, quiet disagreement.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that. It's interesting, there aren't a lot of California Republican congresspeople, but we've got two very powerful ones, actually. Kevin McCarthy from Bakersfield and Devin Nunes, the House Intelligence Committee chair from Visalia. obviously they're going to have a lot of influence in Washington. What does that mean for California generally and the Valley specifically?
I think it's a very, very good thing for the Valley, because not only is McCarthy, of course, a member of the House leadership, but even while Paul Ryan was being somewhat cautious in his support of Trump, Kevin McCarthy was much more enthusiastic and much more.
Devin Nunes. Devin Nunes was much more enthusiastic.
Well, both McCarthy and Nunes.
Oh, you think they both were?
McCarthy more than Ryan, and I was just going to say, and Nunes even more than
he actually
McCarthy.
had a fundraiser.
Yes, and as you saw, Nunes became a key member of the transition right from the outset.
Right.
So I think this bodes very, very well, not just for these members, but for their constituents, not only the people who live in their districts, but the people in other parts of California and the interests in other parts of California who support Nunes and McCarthy on their policy priorities.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. What about the rest of the California delegation, which is overwhelmingly Democratic? Are they going to steal a page out of the Republican playbook and kind of be obstructionists and block the president-elect from day one?
They'll do everything they can. I mean, blocking the president as a congressional minority is not all that easy. I think what you'll see, though, is you'll see California Democrats for the next 4 years acting a lot like Texas Republicans have for the last several. So in other words, if 40 is the new 30 and if orange is the new black, California is the new Texas. Yeah. And just as Texas's elected leaders, Governor Abbott and others, have pushed back very strongly against President Obama's administration for the last several years, you're already seeing not so much Governor Brown, but the legislative leadership, Senator De Leon and Speaker Rendon, already preparing a very aggressive counteroffensive against the new president.
Well, that's going to be very interesting. Up next, we're going to talk about Sacramento. Is it on a collision course with Washington? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Dan Schnur from the USC's Unruh Institute of Politics. While Republicans are leading a one-party government in Washington, Democrats are leading a one-party government in Sacramento. And the stage is set for some significant policy differences. Immigration is obviously one of the big issues up front and center. President Trump says he wants to deport 3 million unauthorized immigrants convicted of crimes. That prompted widespread protests throughout the state. How do you think the immigration issue is going to play out?
Well, I think you're going to see two things going on the immigration issue. One, California's political leadership have understandably realized that in addition to the policy implications, there's tremendous political benefit for a Democratic legislative leader in a deep blue Democratic state to rage against an incoming Republican administration. That's not to say that the policy differences on immigration, on climate change, on healthcare and others are insignificant, but there's a political benefit as well. And we're already seeing from the Attorney General designate and from the legislative leadership not only how willing but how eager they are to push back as hard and as loud as they can.
So I guess we're going to see that. One of the things you just mentioned was healthcare. Republicans have they've been promising repeal of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, for quite some time. But California's been quite successful in getting people to sign up. And if repeal happens, it could blow a $15 to $20 billion hole in the state budget. So if Obamacare is repealed, how is Governor Brown and the California legislature likely to respond?
Well, let's agree that repealing Obamacare is probably more likely when someone named Obama is not in the White House to veto it. So it is certainly
that would have been
likely.
unlikely, yes.
Yeah, exactly. But what the congressional leadership and the president-elect have made very clear is that they do want to repeal it and they do want to replace it. And
are they going to do that simultaneously, or is that going to be in sequential order, or what?
Well, what they're talking about right now, at least at the time of this taping, is repealing it immediately or passing a bill to repeal it right away. But the repeal itself would not take place for 2 or 3 years in order to give them a chance to formulate and pass a new system to take its place. So what we're hearing from a lot
So
of
they didn't have something ready in the wings waiting when they were going to repeal Obamacare, something there that they could initiate?
Ryan and his team have had an alternative to Obamacare for quite some time now. The question of whether it's something that the new administration is going to be comfortable with, whether the President and Secretary Price are going to sign on, is another question. As the Republican congressional leadership correctly points out, Obamacare has been in place for several years now. Replacing it is not something to be done overnight either. And I know some of Trump's strongest supporters are very upset with the idea that it's not going to be repealed immediately. But in fairness, in addition to in fairness to the congressional leadership, you really do have to create some time in order to replace it with something else.
There's also cultural issues that have been in the crosshairs for nationally for Republicans for quite some time. Things like abortion, gay and transgender rights. Do you see any major policy changes on those issues?
Once again, an open question. Trump himself does not seem to have a particularly long history as a very committed social conservative. That said, his early round of appointments suggest it is something that he is making more of a priority. Look, as Barack Obama himself pointed out the day after the election on November 9th, he said, this happens every 4 years. One side wins and one side loses. And there's no question that social conservatives will be in ascendancy, not just because of Trump's victory, but because of the size of Republican margins in Congress, and because of the continued and perhaps enhanced conservative leanings of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, let's talk about education. That's obviously another big issue, Common Core, charter schools, vouchers. Where do you see that going?
One of Trump's most interesting appointments, I think, so far, has been his Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, who's been a longtime proponent of school vouchers. And it's
now let's clarify. Vouchers are giving people money so they can actually go to private schools.
Precisely,
and charters are actually public schools, but they don't have all the rules and regulations that typical public schools have.
Right, and just one additional point of clarity on vouchers. Most voucher programs that would allow public school money to be used to send a student to a private school tends to be limited to those students from the most socially and economically disadvantaged situations. It's relatively rare that a wealthy individual is going to be able to get a voucher to send his or her
because they don't qualify for the voucher?
Precisely. Now, that's not every voucher proposal, but what Ms. DeVos has talked about in the past and what Trump's platform called for were vouchers, but specifically for those students who came from circumstances of economic need. I suspect that this is going to be one of the most important policy debates that takes place over the next 4 years, particularly here in California, where the resistance to vouchers and even to charters in a lot of parts of California is very, very intense.
The governor, was involved with a charter school in Oakland, so who knows how that issue is going to play out. But let me ask you about criminal justice. I want to get to that. Gun control, criminal justice reform, marijuana legalization. How's the Republican federal government going to respond to California on those issues? Are they going to get California to bend on those issues?
Once again, I think you're going to see a dynamic very similar in reverse to what you saw between the Obama administration and Republican states like Texas over the last 8 years. No question, I'd say Attorney General designate Becerra probably becomes one of the most important politicians, not just in California, but in America, because on a lot of these issues, he'll be the one leading the charge.
Okay, up next, we're going to actually talk about the America First approach and what it means for California. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Dan Schnur from the Unruh Institute of Politics at USC about some of the policy conflicts that may emerge between a Republican-led federal government and a Democratically led state government. One issue that Trump really focused on was trade. Unlike some other parts of the country, trade's a pretty important thing for California. What will it mean for California if Trump pulls out of Nafta or rejects the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Well, it's not all that clear at this point exactly what a Trump administration is going to do on trade. Because while Trump, the candidate, was very, very strongly against expanded trade, already you're hearing from his cabinet designees, for the Secretary of Treasury, for Secretary of Commerce, you're hearing them talk about the importance of bilateral trade agreements as opposed to multilateral agreements. And this is somewhere where California's congressional representatives, McCarthy and Devin Nunes in particular, can be of immense help to the people of California, to the agriculture community, to the technology community, to the entertainment community, is having the voice and the presence to say to the President of the United States, we understand that you don't like bad trade deals, but here's why our key constituencies need continued expanded free trade. I know we need to move on, but real quick on this. It's worth remembering the presidents of the United States tend to be much more responsible on these issues than presidential candidates.
Right, there's a difference.
Senator Barack Obama was very strongly against NAFTA and then became a very strong supporter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Trump might not go that far, but I suspect given the people he's surrounding himself with, a lot of this is going to end up being language rather than action.
Okay, let's talk about climate change. California's kind of led the way on that, some landmark climate change legislation. It's going to be challenged by a Republican-led Congress and President-elect Trump. Trump has called climate change a hoax. Is California going to experience kind of a back-to-the-future situation like they had with President Bush, was kind of a pro-fossil fuel agenda, or are Republicans going to be more aggressive and push the federal government to actually preempt California's efforts in this area?
Well, I think generally what you'll see, not just on this issue but on many others, is a federal government being a lot more hands-off on the states, to the states. I mean, that's one of the principles of conservatism, the idea that you let power move from a central authority out into states in local governments. This is the issue that motivates Jerry Brown more than any other. He's been fairly measured on issues about immigration.
Legacy.
Exactly.
Right?
On immigration, on health care. He expresses his concerns, but in a pretty measured way. On this one, he's ready for a fight. But what's changed, Mark, as you know, since the Bush administration 8 years ago, is not the public sector as much as the private sector.
Right.
And more investments in alternative energies, I think, are going to drive the discussion in a different direction than we saw under President Bush.
Even the market, right? I mean, natural gas is becoming more competitive than coal, for example. So you might support clean coal, but natural gas is cheaper.
That's right. And I think, for those who are very, strong proponents of more aggressive climate change measures, it's worth noting that most efforts on this front come out of state and local governments. And for those of you who think the Obama administration has gone so far, California is probably not going to change, but a lot of other states are.
Yeah. Let's talk about infrastructure projects. President Trump President-elect Trump really wants to put a lot of emphasis and frankly, money into infrastructure. If Congress goes along, that's a big if. What state products here in California are likely to benefit?
Well, first of all, there's two different ways to fund an infrastructure project, whether it's roads, whether it's buildings, whether it's bridges, whatever it happens to be. You can fund it through direct government investment, or you can fund it through private sector tax incentives and private sector investment. And the real fight in Washington over the next several months isn't going to be over whether or not to invest in this kind of infrastructure package, but whose money it is, public or private. I think that's where you end up seeing the president, at least at this point, President Trump somewhere in between congressional Democrats and Republicans, because the Democrats love infrastructure.
Right.
They just want the government to pay for it. Republicans are a little bit more leery of this, but if they see it in the context of tax incentives, they're a lot more likely to sign on.
The other thing, too, is low interest rates right now. I mean, so now if you're going to do those big projects, maybe now is the time when interest rates are low. But what about some of those big projects? I mean, let's take the easy one, water. That's probably, I would expect some water infrastructure projects to happen.
Yeah, the Public Policy Institute of California, as you know, not too long ago came out with a fascinating study suggesting that Governor Brown pare back his proposal from 2 tunnels to 1. That sort of split the difference on that. I suspect not because of infrastructure, but because of water policy, I don't think those tunnels are going to happen. The other infrastructure project, which will be the great exception to the Trump push, will almost certainly be the high-speed rail.
Right,
it's almost impossible to see a Republican Congress or a Trump administration signing on to it. I think the investment in infrastructure ends up happening much more at a local and a regional level than on statewide projects like the ones we've been discussing.
Well, you may see those dams. I mean, that's something that Republicans would support. It's primarily helping a lot of the farmers here in the Valley, so you might see something there.
And it's instructive that not only did Dianne Feinstein work with congressional Republicans on the seminal water package at the end of session, but the Obama administration didn't come out against it. Yeah. Barbara Boxer was there all by herself, but even Obama did not express any public concern about it.
Well, that's interesting. So anyway, up next, we're going to actually talk about the Republican control in Washington and whether it's going to be a headwind or a tailwind for the California Republican Party. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Dan Schnur from USC. Consider this. Donald Trump lost California by 30 points, the largest margin of any losing Republican candidate since 1992. Both U.S. senators and every statewide elected official are Democrats. 3/4 of the congressional delegation from California are Democrats. And Democrats now have a supermajority in both houses of the California legislature. Could a President Trump and a Republican Congress change those results in the future? You know, one of the things we haven't touched on is the Supreme Court.
By the way.
Oh, by the way, the answer is no. Okay, but
Go on.
maybe. I mean, the Supreme Court is a possibility. Let me explain why. You know, Justice Scalia passed away before he could rule on a case dealing with union dues. Union dues are a major funder for Democratic candidates. If a Trump nominee gets on the court, presumably conservative, and rules like Scalia would have likely ruled, isn't that going to have a major impact on the California Democratic Party?
It's going to have a huge impact on organized labor, no question. If the U.S. Supreme Court were to rule that these union dues were not constitutional, that they were a violation of free speech, that would be a crushing blow to organized labor in the country. That said, unions are only one contributing factor to the deep blue dominance of Democrats in California.
But the money is significant. And one of the things that's interesting about this topic is, unions are required by law to represent the members, whether they pay dues or not. If you set up a system where unions have to provide the representation, but the member doesn't have to pay, that's like going to a restaurant and saying, I want a meal, but I don't have to pay for it. And so that's what unions would say, right? And so that's an unsustainable business model.
Well, there's no question it would be of help to Republicans all across the country.
Well, look at Wisconsin.
But it's also worth noting exactly how deep a hole Republicans are in California, much deeper than they ever were in Wisconsin or in other right-to-work states. Just a real quick point on this. On the flip side, though, Mark, it's worth noting exactly how unique California is in the national political landscape. There are 25 states in the country that have Republican governors and Republican-controlled legislators. There are 21 other states that have a split between the governor and the legislature. There are 4 states out of 50 that have both a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislator. The next biggest one after California is Oregon. And just in case you're wondering, the other 2 are Hawaii and Rhode Island.
Yeah, right. Hawaii was going to be in there somewhere.
Exactly.
So what do you think about the Republican takeover in Washington? How is it going to impact the governor's race in California in 2018?
I don't think it's going to have much of an impact, unless yet another self-funded Republican runs for governor. It's awfully difficult to see. I mean, actually swearing in here would be an excellent candidate for statewide office on a more level playing field. But I will predict to you, Mark, and your viewers and listeners, that there will be a no-party preference governor of California before the next Republican is elected to that office.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, the party's hold, particularly on the issue of immigration, is so deep at this point that simply on branding, it's almost an unfixable challenge.
Well, there are going to be a lot of changes, obviously, as a result of a Trump administration and Republican control of Congress. You think ultimately that's going to help or hurt the Republican brand in California?
It depends what Trump does on immigration. If he decides to focus simply on deporting those undocumented immigrants who have committed serious and violent crimes, then it probably doesn't have much of an impact. If he does broaden his scope much wider, not only to those who've committed crimes other than their immigration status, but begins to work to deport undocumented immigrants on a broader scale otherwise, then that's going to make the Republicans' hole here in this state even deeper.
Yeah, and let me ask you this, though. So what is the path back to relevancy for the California Republican Party?
Well, I don't want to sound like Johnny One Note on this, but in a state with such a large and growing Hispanic American and Asian American population, the issue of immigration is simply a boulder in the road for California Republicans. And unless and until they decide to address it in a fundamentally different way, there is no path back.
So it's all about demographics?
It's not only, it is about demographics, but not the way that you and your viewers are probably thinking. Because I mentioned Hispanic American and Asian American voters, but young voters of all ethnicities, young Caucasian voters overwhelmingly in California, according to our poll, support comprehensive immigration reform with a pathway to citizenship. Now, there are other challenges for Republicans here, but until you get that boulder out of the road, the path back for Republicans is a very difficult one.
I want to thank our guest, Dan Schnur, from the Jesse Unruh Institute of Politics at USC. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, if you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can follow the Maddy Institute on Facebook, Twitter, or log on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.